In the aftermath of the Civil War, there were many questions raised about what would the future of the United States be. And during this process, many questions were left unanswered in the aftermath. And we'll look at this in this lecture. If we look at the legacy of the Civil War, what happened, it was, of course, the first modern warfare. And you can tell that in part because of the scale of the dead. Over 620,000 dead by conservative estimates. The use of new techniques, the use of new military tactics, and the use of new materials of war all led to the tremendous number of dead in the Civil War. The South, of course, was devastated, and not just in areas where the battles took place, but also in areas where there were no battles because many of the men of the South had to leave their farms, had to leave their jobs, and go to battle. And so not only was the landscape altered, but economically they were devastated. They lost a lot of property, and they lost slaves. Once slavery was over at the end of the Civil War, then a lot of the value that people had invested in slaves disappeared. So they were completely devastated following the war. Finally, the triumph of the industrial North. The North won the war. Its diplomacy was the one that other countries were interacting with, and it also, its way of governing succeeded. The Southern way, which is more states' rights, failed, and a more unified government emerged throughout the nation. Finally, and this is true of any war, the role of women changes during the Civil War, largely because the men are gone. Either they're off fighting or they're dead. And so women have to be responsible for more of the day-to-day actions going on, but then this is going to translate into political action as well. Reconstruction raised several questions. First, you have to answer what was the Civil War in order to figure out how to proceed. How would the nation be reunited? Who would be in charge of this process? All of this was determined on how you define what the war was. If the states really did leave the Union, then they were no longer states. They were conquered territory. If it was a rebellion, then wouldn't they just come back in as they had been before? Things would just be restored to normal. You were just putting down an insurrection. But if secession was real, if the states had actually committed suicide, then that meant a very different vision of the future and how it would proceed. And of course, what would become of the former slaves? What did they want for themselves, these people that had been freed following slavery? We had to answer those questions as well. Partially, we address that by creating the Bureau of Freedmen, Refugees, and Abandoned Lands, sometimes known as the Freedmen's Bureau. Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. The Freedmen's Bureau, run by the military under the command of General Oliver Otis Howard. They had 1 year to determine how things were going to be done with the freedmen. And so this is going to also bring in to question who controls Reconstruction. Is it going to be the president or is it going to be Congress? At Lincoln's death, Lincoln's plan was to ease the South back into the Union. And before he died in December of 1863, he issued the 10% plan. It was really called the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction, but it was a very lenient process which states could just propose that their citizens declare future loyalty to the United States, and that would be good enough. And several states did come in under this proclamation that Lincoln had issued, the so-called 10% plan. But that, many people say, well, why was he so lenient? Why did he let the South off the hook? What advantages were there to such a moderate policy? Well, Lincoln wanted people to come back in. He wanted those states to come back in. He wanted people to think of themselves as American citizens again. But Congress was not so willing to be so lenient. And so when representatives from these states were seated, they were refused admission into the House of Congress. And so two representatives, a Senator Wade and a Representative Davis, introduced this bill known as the Wade-Davis bill, the first Republican plan of Reconstruction, and it was much harsher. It had the so-called ironclad oath, which meant that a majority of the population had to declare in an estate that they had always been faithful to the Union. Well, that was very hard to do because what does that mean? That you didn't aid and you didn't assist the Confederates? Well, but what if they took your mule? What if they took your horse or took your weapons or took your carts or took food that you were growing? Does that mean you were aiding them? Well, it might. And so it was a difficult oath to take. So Lincoln refused to sign the bill once it was passed. That's a pocket veto. And then Congress issued the Wade-Davis Manifesto later on that summer. And what that manifesto said was that the president didn't have any business interfering in Congress's right to run Reconstruction. Congress also created the Freedmen's Bureau. As I mentioned before, it was under General O. Howard. It had 1 year to solve the problems and to transition former slaves into a new world of freedom and citizenship. So they had to reunite families. They had to provide medical care. They had to, in many cases, negotiate labor contracts for the new employees. So it was a big task in a short amount of time, and it was really unworkable. In April of 1865, Lincoln went to a theater shortly after Robert E. Lee surrendered, and he was assassinated. A new president, the Vice President Andrew Johnson, a Democrat, who also was very hard on the South, issued a proclamation of amnesty of his own. And this was a little bit tougher if you were wealthy in the South, if you were a plantation owner, or if you were a high military officer. You could be allowed back in as a citizen of the United States, but you had to appeal to the president directly. We enter a period of what we call Congressional or Radical Reconstruction. This was in response to what the Southern states were doing for their freedmen or to their freedmen. They were issuing black codes, and these black codes severely restricted the rights of freedom that the former slaves now were supposed to enjoy. It restricted their rights. It restricted what they could own. They couldn't own guns, for example, in some places. It varied from state to state, but many people saw this as a return to slavery by another name. And so Congress extended the length of the Freedmen's Bureau. It extended the life of the Freedmen's Bureau to try to address these issues. They passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the first Civil Rights Act in American history, and then to shore that up in order to protect the Civil Rights Act from another Congress coming in and changing it, they wrote it in as an amendment. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution, the second plan of Reconstruction, was ratified by the people in the states in July of 1868, and those states not in the Union had to ratify that in order to come back into the Union. The 14th Amendment was probably one of the most important amendments in American history to date. The Supreme Court has interpreted it many times. It's often used as the case for civil rights issues. Congressional power continued to grow. Not everyone in the South liked the 14th Amendment, and some states refused to ratify it. And President Johnson wasn't a big fan of it. He thought that the Republicans were getting too much power. And so during the midterm elections, he went on the so-called swing around the circle, got on board a train and went out to the Ohio River Valley and began speaking against Republicans during the election campaign season. He wasn't very well received. A lot of people were Republicans, didn't like what the president was saying. The president may have been drunk at the time. There's some discussion about that, and he was actually calling for the hanging of radical Republicans. It wasn't well received. He was booed. He was hissed. People were throwing objects at him, and so he went back. When the election came around, more Republicans were added, and they passed a series of laws called the Reconstruction Acts, which severely limited the president's power, Johnson's power. First one was the Military Reconstruction Act. This put the South under the control of the military. They imposed martial law. It was divided up into 5 districts. Then, because the president is in charge of the military, supposedly he's the commander-in-chief, they passed a law which took that power away from him. It was called the Command of the Army Act, which said that the Army was under the command of the general. So, at that point, it was Ulysses S. Grant. He was the general of the Army, and so he was, in effect, the leader. Every command that Johnson issued had to go through the general. Johnson thought that was unconstitutional, and he was probably right. Finally, there was the Tenure of Office Act. The Tenure of Office Act protected radical Republicans that Lincoln had appointed. What they told Johnson was, with this act, was that the president could not fire anybody he did not hire. Well, all of these appointments, the radical Republicans in the cabinet, were Lincoln's appointments. And so Johnson hadn't appointed them, he inherited them. And so if they disagreed with him, he could not get rid of them. And so this severely limited his power. He also felt this was a violation of his constitutional authority. In order to protect their power, the Congress also threatened to reduce the number of justices on the Supreme Court, following the Ex parte Milligan decision of 1866. And Congress was supreme. They were victorious. The Supreme Court backed down, and so Congress was allowed to have its way. Now, I mentioned earlier that Johnson thought that some of these Reconstruction Acts were unconstitutional violations of his power, and as I said, he was probably correct, and he began to violate them. He fired the Secretary of War, replaced him with Grant. He thought Grant would do his bidding, but Grant was more independent than Johnson thought. The House brought charges of impeachment against Johnson, and the Senate began the trials in March of 1868. At the end of the summer, the impeachment failed by 1 vote, but Johnson was a lame duck. Presidential Reconstruction was dead, and Congress was, by this time, in charge of the Reconstruction process. During this time, all the states but Mississippi, Texas, and Virginia came back into the Union. They were required to adopt the 15th Amendment, but you also see some response among the populace of these states with the rise of so-called clannish groups. Now, we think about the Ku Klux Klan, and certainly there was a group called the Ku Klux Klan, but there were a lot of other groups who were vigilante groups or terrorist groups which frightened African Americans in the South in order to control the voter, keep them away from voting, to threaten them. And also they were attacking a lot of Freedmen's Bureau employees, especially school teachers. They would burn schoolhouses, they would flog or whip teachers, murder them in some cases, or attack them and physically abuse them. Well, after Johnson was out of office, the newly elected president was the hero of the Civil War, Ulysses S. Grant. And his administration saw several developments in the expansion of the United States. They added Alaska. He was elected in 1968 and again in 1872, but he made some poor political appointments. Again, they did acquire Alaska during this time, so the United States did expand, and that was largely due to the diplomatic prowess of Secretary of State Hamilton Fish. And there were some other negotiations, relationships with Great Britain and others that Fish successfully oversaw. However, there were other problems, and there was a lot of corruption. There was good parts again. I said there was diplomatic successes. There was also the establishment of a civil service commission. So it was a mixed bag. And the problems, and I mentioned the corruption earlier, became known in the populace as Grantism. For one thing, Grant continued the Reconstruction stationing of troops throughout the South. And this was a problem especially for Southerners. There was also corruption. The Credit Mobilier scandal was a land grafting scandal where people were trying to control land And there was a false company set up called the Credit Mobile Gay scandal. It was railroad land. And Grant's associates and sometimes cabinet members were involved in this. There was also the gold market scandal. Jay Gould of the railroad magnate tried to control the stock market, and this led to a panic in 1873. Grant was blamed for this. Nobody ever blamed him directly, but it was his friends and his associates who were charged in much of this corruption, even perhaps his wife. At the election of 1866, Grant probably would have liked to have run for a third time, but he did not. He saw that he wasn't going to win, and so a Democrat and a Republican candidate who ran, Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, Samuel J. Tilden, the Democrat, but they got a number of votes so that it was very difficult to see who the winner was. And in fact, there was a lot of debate. They had to count and recount the votes in many places, and they still could not clearly determine who had honestly won the election. So several committees were formed. Finally, a committee of 15 which sat down and they worked out a compromise that gave the Republicans under Hayes the presidency and promised the Democrats that they would remove Southern military troops, and eventually they did. And so on April 23rd, 1877, the last of the troops were removed from from Baton Rouge, rather, in Louisiana, and Reconstruction officially came to an end. The question is, how do we evaluate the Reconstruction process? Was it a success or was it a failure? And it really depends on your perspective, how you look at it and what you're looking at. Of course, African Americans who had been enslaved in the South were now free, and in the North too, were now free, and some were buying homes, some were working on their own and reestablishing their families. However, there was still a lot of problems that they faced. Discrimination, segregation, and the Freedmen's Bureau had done a good job as far as education was concerned, but in other areas, people weren't so sure. Economically, the United States recovered and it began turning its mind towards business, and we'll talk about that in the next unit. But the question of whether or not Reconstruction was successful or not is still up in the air.